Want help to grow your business? Download BRiN, the world's first business advisor in your pocket. To find out more, visit BRiN.ai or search the App Store today.
I walked towards this lady and I had my hand outstretched. I was going to shake hands with her. As we got close, she stepped inside that handshake and she took me in an embrace. And she hugged me like a grandma hugs you. And you know that you're loved when a grandma hugs you. She put her head on my shoulder and she started to cry. I'd never met this lady before. She was an Australian and we were in Thailand. And what I learnt was that this lady had lost her daughter in the Boxing Day tsunami. And we found her, but she was dead. Now her daughter was on the holiday of a lifetime. You see, it was her honeymoon. So this lady that I was hugging, she lost her daughter and she also lost her son-in-law. We found him and he was dead as well. Now this couple had been together for a number of years before they got married. And 6 months prior to the wedding, they received some very special news. That was they're going to be parents. Well, of course, the baby died as well. So this lady that I was hugging, she lost her daughter, she lost her son-in-law, and she lost her future grandchild. And she also lost any hope of any future grandchildren because her daughter was an only child. Now, the hug that I was receiving from this lady, it should have been for her daughter. It should have been for her son-in-law. It should have been for her grandchildren. But it never would be. And this represents both the beauty and the tragedy of the work that I've done in this environment. And working in these areas, you meet people who are on journeys. Some of them will be filled with fear, and some will be filled with hope. And it's hope which is the strongest emotion that we have. And working in these areas, we're certainly presented with unique challenges. And to meet those unique challenges, we have to have unique solutions. And what we know as a result of the Boxing Day tsunami was that there was somewhere between 250 and 300,000 people who would lose their lives as a result of that across several different countries. And in Thailand, we would recover the bodies of 5,395 souls who would perish that day. And it was our role to identify these bodies and send them home. And in Thailand, when someone dies, they'll take the body to a temple. And temples in Thailand are called a wat, a W-A-T. And if you've ever been to a Buddhist temple, you'll understand when I say they have a very serene feel about them, a very sacred feel, regardless of whatever your faith is. And I arrived at this Buddhist temple called Wat Yan Yao. I walked in through the gates and all I could see covering the entire area was the decomposing bodies of 3,500 people. Now, as a forensic practitioner, we have to do a post-mortem on each of these people. But where do you store the bodies of 3,500 people? And these were the challenges that faced the police on these initial days when they arrived at the temple at Wat Yan Yao. How do we meet these unique challenges? Well, it's about building teams, and it's about building these teams very, very quickly. Because when we deploy internationally into these areas, we don't have a lot of time for team building exercises. We don't have a lot of time for planning because there's an expectation that we'll start and we'll execute as quickly as we can. And it comes down to a number of things. And I think the most important thing is about leadership. And I think there's two types of leadership that exists. There's one about positional authority, and there's one about leadership without authority. And it's about the way that people are defined through their actions and their reactions. It's what people do when they're in these circumstances that really defines true leaders. And I think when I reflect back on the work in Thailand, I think that there were a number of things that defined the leaders. And the first was that those that would ultimately lead this operation, they led with speed. Because when there's an opportunity, when there's a gap within the marketplace, so often it's the first to move that will hold these positions of leadership. Because if we wait until we have all of the answers to all of the questions, someone will beat us to it. The second thing that defined the leaders was they led with a sense of sensitivity, because we're dealing with immense change, we're dealing with immense emotions, and it was so important to lead with change, but to do it with sensitivity. And working in these environments, when I worked in Bali after the bombings, there were 202 people who would die as a result of that, and they were taken to the hospital called Sangla Hospital in Denpasar. The mortuary in Sangla had a capacity for 6. There were 202 bodies that were recovered as a result of the bombings. And many of them were laid out in the walkways in between the hospital wards in those early days and covered with ice. And family members would walk and search for their loved ones. Because if you find yourself caught up in one of these disasters and you lose a member of your family, there's an overwhelming desire to find them, to have them identified and bring them home so you can bury them according to your faith and your beliefs. So family members would walk throughout that hospital. And in Thailand, families gathered at the temple at Wat Yanyao and would walk throughout the temple. And I would meet this lady who lost her 7-year-old daughter. And for 3 days, she searched amongst the thousands of bodies. At the end of the 3rd day, she came across the body of a young girl on the ground. And she said to the local Thai police who were running it at the time, "This is the body of my daughter." And they said to her, "Are you sure?" And she said, "Without question." They said, "All right, that's a visual identification, you can take her home." But they made a mistake. When you make a mistake in this environment, it's hard to undo. It's hard to come back from. So we had to impose our standards upon the Thais, our standards upon the Indonesians. Because there's only one conversation I've had on a professional level which is harder than sitting opposite a family and saying to them, "Yes, your daughter has died." The only thing more challenging is to sit opposite that family and say to them, "Yes, your daughter has died. She has been identified, but mistakenly, she's been taken by another family. They've now cremated her and they've spread her ashes on a beach somewhere special to them." You don't come back from that. You can't undo that. And this is why it was so important to impose our standards and our procedures upon those that we're working with. These were some of the things that the leaders in these responses did so well. It was about their speed, their sensitivity, having a structure in place, and at times leading with simplicity. But the overriding element, the overriding behaviour that stood out so much was the presence of leaders. Because if we want to be a leader in an organisation in times of crisis, we need to be present, and it conveys 2 things. 1, we understand, and 2, that we care. And these were so many of the experiences that I went through in Thailand, working after the Boxing Day tsunami. What I worked and experienced in Bali after the bombings. I also worked in Japan after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. I spent time working in Saudi Arabia after the floods in Jeddah. But it was the events of Thailand that would change my life. And they had an impact upon me which I could never go back from. And I've spoken a bit about the work in crisis and disaster situations, but it's not about that. It's about understanding that leadership matters, and there'll be opportunities presented for us. We'll see things in the events of crisis or disaster, and it's up to us if we want to take action. But it's not about crisis. It's not about disaster. It's about deciding that leadership matters. If we want to make a difference in our workplace, in the communities in which we live, the schools where our children go. It's about deciding that leadership matters and taking action when that opportunity presents. I met a group of children, 32 children, who had all lost their parents, and they were living in a tent. And this tent that they were living in was a good-looking tent, I grant you that, but it was still just a tent. 32 of these children who had all lost their homes. So many of them had lost their brothers and sisters, and they'd certainly all lost their parents. And when I met the children, there was nothing that was coming. They weren't waiting for something to happen. And with a colleague of mine from the UK that I'd met, we said, let's see if we can do something. Because what I realised was I couldn't change what had happened, but we could change what happened next. I couldn't change the fact that these kids had lost their parents, but I felt within my capacity that we could change what happened next. So we started an organisation called Hands Across the Water. And the idea was to see if we could raise enough money and build a home for these kids to change the way that they spent each night. Now, at the time of making the decision, I had no idea how I was going to do it. I was still working full-time in the police. I'd never been involved in any type of fundraising before. I had no idea what I was doing. But I thought, well, we should at least make an attempt. So we started the organisation called Hands Across the Water. And
to continue enjoying this presentation, download BRiN, the world's first business advisor in your pocket. To find out more, visit BRiN.ai or search the App Store today.